There's a sequence to learning, and we're starting with what are the kind of ready conditions to get the brain ready to learn, right? So mindset, optimism, that ballpark, we start there. Then the next question is, how do I evaluate the stuff I'm learning very, very quickly? If we are kind of aiming for accelerated learning, accelerated skills acquisition, things you need in peak performance to stay in that challenge skills sweet spot, maximize flow over time, maximize performance over time, we got to onboard this stuff fast.
What does it take to do the impossible? What does it take to level up your game like never before? What does it take for individuals, organizations, for even institutions to achieve paradigm shifting? Nothing is ever the same again. Breakthroughs.
Our mission is to decode the neurobiology of flow and cognitive peak performance. Access the minds of maverick scientists, groundbreaking innovators, and world-leading experts to understand what it takes to achieve ultimate human performance, so you can feel your best, perform your best, and accomplish your boldest goals. I'm your host, Rian Doris, and together with best-selling author Steven Kotler, I present to you Flow Research Collective Radio. Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's masterclass with Steven Kotler. We're going to be covering learning, and specifically we're going to be covering a couple of aspects of learning that are really important and often not really talked about that much. First is mindset, which is talked about a lot, but not necessarily specifically in the context of learning. And we're also going to be talking about truth filters, which are really important, and you'll hear exactly what those are in a little bit. But Steven, great to have you here. Thank you for taking the time. So first question for you is...
Hold on. You're going to introduce yourself? Rian Doris, ladies and gentlemen.
I'll take that. Glad to be here too. So how do you think about mindset in the context of learning?
Yeah, I always say that, learning is so important in the context of peak performance and flow. It's 1/4 of the art of impossible is devoted to it. And the reason is to maximize flow.
Yep.
We have to stay in the challenge skills sweet spot, right? The most important, or one of the most important flow triggers is known as challenge skills balance, meaning we pay the most attention to the task at hand when that challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. You want to stretch, but not snap. What does that mean? That means we're going to be using our skills to the utmost on a sort of daily basis. That's how we stay in that sweet spot. If you can't onboard new skills to keep pace, you basically lock yourself out of flow, right? You use flow, it accelerates you, but if you can't onboard the new skills to keep pace with the speed of your momentum, you're going to start to stall or plateau, which are, by the way, demotivating under normal circumstances. But if you've had a whole bunch of flow and suddenly you start to stall and plateau, it's really frustrating because all the happy drugs have been turned off and now it's just all about grit, right? Yeah. So you really want to know how to learn. And the place you got to start that quest is with mindset. And this is Carol Dweck's work at Stanford. It's come under a little bit of scrutiny lately. There's been some kind of failure to replicate problems. But this particular finding that we're talking about, there have been no problems with, as far as I know, and it's holding up really, really well. And I think it's one of the most important things she discovered, which is that if you have a fixed mindset, meaning you think talent is innate and that you can't learn, right? No amount of hard work will get you farther, versus a growth mindset, which talent is just a starting point and I can grow and learn, struggle and get better. So if you look at brain scans of people who are faced with a problem to solve and they have a fixed mindset, what you see is almost no activity in the brain. The reason is the brain goes, oh, you can't do that. You don't do that. So it doesn't even waste any energy to try. Right? So literally you cannot learn if you believe you cannot learn. Like it seems to be flat out like it turns off the neurobiological machinery that allows you to learn. So that's, I think, a really important place to start.
So you need a growth mindset to learn.
You need a growth mindset to learn. It's not, growth mindsets are trainable, and we don't have one. This is a misconception about mindset. Like, there's not one, you don't have a fixed or a growth mindset about everything in your life. They're piecemeal. Right? I was not a good athlete when I was growing up, especially when I was younger. Very uncoordinated, wasn't very strong, very skinny, very sick kid. Everything going against me. And I, for a really long time, thought I was just a bad athlete. I was never going to be a good athlete. Like everybody else in the family got the genes. I did not get the genes. Well. And, I sort of stepped into it sideways because I started skiing, but this was in the 70s. Skiing wasn't a sport. It was sort of a pastime, or, it became an action sport, and it became this other thing. It was a lifestyle maybe, but it wasn't really the same as like the sports that I was bad at. Same thing with skateboarding, right? We didn't call them action sports until by the 90s. They were just like these weird things we were doing in the 70s, right? Random hobbies that seemed to swallow people whole.
Right.
And, so I started to get better at sports that were not sports, which is how I sort of evaded my growth mindset. And then suddenly they became sports, and I was like, holy crap, I'm good at sports.
Yeah, they got called sports after you
after I got good at them. Yeah. And so I was like, oh wow, okay, I got de factoed in. But it switched my mindset, and suddenly actually everything sort of exploded, and I really could grow as a skier and as an athlete and all that stuff after it switched, which was funny and ironic. But it's all, I never had a fixed mindset about, say, writing or reading or learning, because I've just been doing it for so long. I never had time to get a fixed mindset. I've just, all my life, it's stayed in that growth mindset. So certain things, you're born with a growth mindset. Certain things, you're born with a fixed mindset. And certain things, we did a video recently about training your weaknesses, and I talked about learning legalese. There were years when my contracts would come in, my agents would send them to me, and I would look at them and I go, I'm never going to know what this says. Like, never. Doesn't matter. I don't care, right? And no, turns out a little bit of elbow grease, being patient myself, and, suddenly you're there. And so you can shift them. It's often helpful to sort of identify in advance, where are my fixed mindsets? Where don't I think I can learn? How can I start undoing those notions, reframing it, pushing on that a little bit? So I think that's, that gets us into the learning conversation. That's got to be our first step.
Yeah, well, you mentioned about identifying mindset is really important. I think almost being able to develop like a little bit of a spidey sense as to where you are having or encountering fixed and growth mindsets with respect to different things is key, because if you don't know that you've got a fixed mindset within a certain department or a certain thing, you can't really take action to try and
I often find, by the way, frustration, right? When I'm suddenly frustrated and a little pissed for no reason, that's one of the tells, because it's often computer tech problems are a great example. Right. I am not great at fixing computer tech problems, but I no longer have a fixed mindset about it, thanks to Apple Care and their endless patience with me. Yes, I will spend 9 hours on the phone with you, Mr. Kotler, to teach you how to restart your Mac. Right. Eventually I got over that one. But when I encounter tech problems, and even today, even though I've got now a growth mindset about them, my instant reaction is a fixed mindset rather than, hey, wait a minute, I like even stuff that I know how to fix when it first comes up. So that's often a way for me to tell. And I think most people probably don't have my signal. You're going to have a signal though. Yeah. Find the signal is a key point there. One signal I find is if I'm comparing to others in a certain specific way of, oh, that's a thing other people do. That's not me, that's another kind of tell. But the tells are definitely very individualized. So try and identify the tells. Is there anything else that you recommend for people before we get into the rest of the learning components, just for identifying fixed mindsets? I don't think it's really complicated. I think it's just not something we're used to doing. And so most people don't even think about the fact that they can identify them. I don't think it's particularly hard. And if you have fixed mindsets about something, as skills you have to acquire, you're obviously going to have to find a way to reframe it, right? And change that mindset. That may require usually a little bit of learning, just like a little bit more reading, finding something that you're vaguely curious about inside that space is often a good way to do it. Building some momentum. A little bit, Right. Are there any other aspects of mindset besides the fixed to growth continuum that are important or helpful when it comes to learning? I think that term gets used to cover a huge swatch of things. When you talk about mindset, are you talking about optimism? Is that a portion of mindset? Like Peter Diamandis, my writing partner on Bold and Abundance and Faster, would absolutely tell you optimism is part of mindset. And certainly, a Matt Ridley style rational optimism, magical thinking is very harmful to peak performance for a lot of reasons. It ends up being very demotivating. It's like using affirmations, right? When your brain knows they're not true. Same thing with magical thinking. Like there's a part of your brain that knows that it's sort of magical thinking oftentimes, and that ends up being demotivating over time. But rational optimism, grounded optimism, really good for peak performance. Fantastic for peak performance. Opens you up. You start taking in way more novel information.
Yeah, improves divergent thinking and positive affect. Yeah, that makes sense. And then, so segueing from mindset to truth filters, which is our next topic. Before I go into specific questions on the different forms of truth filters, anything you want to mention about truth filters?
Yeah, so you got to understand that there's a sequence to learning. We're starting with what are the kind of ready conditions to get the brain ready to learn, right? So mindset, optimism, that ballpark, we start there. Then the next question is, how do I evaluate the stuff I'm learning very, very quickly? If we are kind of aiming for accelerated learning, accelerated skills acquisition, things you need in peak performance to stay in that challenge skills sweet spot, maximize flow over time, maximize performance over time, we got to onboard this stuff fast. So you need to be able to evaluate anything you're learning very, very, very quickly. And there are very famous systems, philosophical systems in a sense, in place to do this. This is not a new problem. This is a very old problem. The scientific method is a truth filter, is a way of evaluating information. Investigative journalists have a different methodology, and then ancient Greek philosophers had first principle thinking, and we'll talk about sort of all three. Now, there are others, and you can endlessly kind of subdivide these categories and different ways to think about them. A lot of different rabbit holes to go down. I like to keep things pretty simple and straightforward. Let's start with investigative journalism.
Okay. Just before we dive in, I just want to make sure folks are tracking. So what would you describe truth filters as in general?
Truth filters are a way to assess information for, is it accurate? Is it truthful? Can I act on it? Right? Flow massively amplifies our speed, but you have to be able to kind of act on the information, the stuff you're learning very, very quickly to keep pace with the acceleration that the state provides. So truth filters are a really good way. And also, I think, very important, because in flow, you get a load of dopamine, a lot of happy juice. And, dopamine is really great within a certain bandwidth, but you turn it up too much, you start moving into schizophrenia. Right?
Mania.
And you start seeing patterns that are not there.
Yeah.
So you really want kind of deep, well-established truth filters. So when you encounter the dopamine that naturally comes with flow and we want, it's great. But it's going to lie to you, right? We have Flow Research Collective swag that says never trust the dopamine for this exact reason. Right. The dopamine is the greatest thing about doing this work, or one of the greatest things in terms of it feels really, really, really good, but cocaine produces a lot of dopamine, right? That also feels really, really, really good. You know what I mean? Not necessarily you don't trust those things. So you want a way to evaluate information, especially when you're in peak states, a little more rigorous, and certainly when just learning so you can get into those states faster. That's how I think of truth filters.
No, that makes sense, yeah. And they kind of help combat the cognitive dopamine distortions that can come through.
I think so.
Investigative journalism then as the first sort of swatch of truth filters or approach.
Yeah, and I always like to tell a really embarrassing story about myself. The standard investigative journalism tact has always been, when I was coming up as a journalist, if you find a fact, discover a fact, and then you can get 3 experts to confirm it, you can publish it. Now, fact checkers for magazines, and if you're writing for the New York Times magazine, either, if you're having a scientific fact or whatever, then you're going to have to backtrack it to a research article. But if, somebody says something happened, right, you need 3 people to confirm it before you can publish it. So I was doing a story for Discover magazine on the neurobiology, what's happening in the brain during mystical experiences. And I was focusing a lot on out-of-body and near-death experiences. And one of the very first, this was in the sort of late 90s, and one of the very first things I discovered, and these were really outsider weird topics for outside of science. At that point, they were very fringe. Now they're very mainstream. At that point, they were incredibly fringe. In fact, this article was the first major article in any science publication about the science underneath this stuff. So that had not happened, right? Getting it right, because it was a big step forward, was important. And one of the first things I discovered was, holy crap, there's a lot of research that had been done, right? It was everywhere. And so I did what a curious journalist would do. I asked my source, hey, why isn't this common knowledge? Like, if you look at the Gallup survey, for example, 10 to 20% of the American people have had a near-death or out-of-body experience. That's tens of millions of people, right? That's a huge amount of people. And if we actually understood what was causing these things, you know, when tens of millions of people want to know something, that's usually front page news. Right? So I was like, why is this not front page? I don't get it. And he said, oh, it's because these two, they were not even great scientists. They were sort of like quasi-charlatan, new age, spiritual dudes, wrote these books, and they both became bestsellers, and real scientists got scared off. And that's what happened. And that's why this isn't front page news, because anybody who does this work does it really quietly, because the science community will hate you and you want to get grants, et cetera, et cetera. And I asked a second source, and I asked a third source, and they all gave me the same two names and told me the same stories. And we went to press that way, and I got a very angry phone call from one of the scientists whose name I named, and it turns out I had slandered the guy. He had not written a best-selling book on altered states of consciousness. He had actually he published a collection of scientific articles about things, et cetera, et cetera. They all gave me the same wrong name. There was a different scientist, and they actually gave me the name of a man who was then one of the most important and solid and respectable altered states of consciousness researchers in America. And mind you, I later went into this field. So like one of the giants of this field, he doesn't know it because he can't remember, but he hates me. He really hates me. I sent him flowers. I sent my editor flowers. I wrote him a long note. It was there was a fact checker who missed it. My editor, everybody missed it.
And everyone you asked?
Everybody asked, same thing. And it was because I don't know how it happened, but it happened. And the names aren't even similar. But so what I discovered is, oh, wow, that's bad. I should ask a couple more people. If everybody else is going to ask 3, I'm going to get 5 sources for every fact. And that, by the way, is the Flow Research Collective. We try to have 5 sources for every fact. And the reason I've settled on the number 5 is because I've noticed when you're going down an information chain, 3 or 4 people will often give you the exact same response. But if you go to that 5th or 6th person, they invert everything you had been told before, and you often have to go ask 3 or 4 or 5 more people.
Yeah, when I was first doing research, I noticed that oftentimes publications like Harvard Business Review or things like, or sometimes even places like The Atlantic would cite certain things. You'd try and find the source, and the source would be another publication like that wasn't direct research. And then you try and find the source from that. And you'd just kind of be like in this same area of surface level information, and they're all just citing each other, and it's very difficult to actually penetrate down to the baseline source. Because often, sometimes there isn't one, and it's just citations about citations. So they're
quoting other people, not citing them, right? And it gets hard to
differentiate.
So it's hard to it's a hard line. You're absolutely correct. Anyway, so now these days is an investigative approach. I think, okay, if I've got a fact that I'm going to really trust and sort of like build upon, 3 to 5 sources have to kind of confirm it to me. Then I'm like, okay, now I'm willing to teach it to other people and say, this is the science. This is why we think it's the science, that sort of stuff. So that's sort of the investigative journalist approach. This is not quick, right? But when you approach sort of everything in this way, right, the big things that you're dealing with that are sort of foundational in this way, over time, you get faster at sort of detecting where should I be skeptical, where should I not, right? The muscle develops.
Hey there, Rian Doris here again. Sorry to interrupt for a quick moment. I wanted to remind you that if you want to pre-order Steven's new book, theartofimpossible.com, we have over $1,500 worth of peak performance bonuses that you can access immediately. They will get dropped straight into your inbox just for the price of the book, which is about $30. So it's a really, really super deal. and it's theartofimpossible.com to claim the bonuses. The bonuses include all sorts of cool things like secret chapters from Steven's past books that he never ended up releasing. They include an impossible goal setting masterclass, how to set goals the right way. They include a course on mitigating distraction and maximizing attention to accelerate into flow, and much more. So you're going to love the bonuses. Go to theartofimpossible.com or click the link in the show notes and you can check out and get them dropped straight into your inbox. Alrighty, back to the episode. So what would be, an example or case scenario where someone would deploy that method if they want to learn about a topic themselves and make sure what they're learning is accurate?
Yeah, exactly.
Or they're writing,
exactly.
or
if they're writing, if they're speaking, or they're presenting the ideas in any way to a boss, to the company, right? You're going to a meeting and how do you know this is, how do you know the press release, all that stuff. And certainly, by the way, when you're learning in general, acquiring new skills, reading, right? Like, you still want 3 to 5 sources, right? You may be reading like the world's leading expert on the thing that you're reading about, but it's still only one person,
right?
Yeah,
that makes total sense. So anytime someone is conveying information, basically, and wants to make sure it's tight, triple check the sources or quintuple check the sources. Scientific method, you were going to go on to?
Scientific method is data gathering, generate a hypothesis, test your hypothesis, be able to falsify your hypothesis, right? And, modify and go forward that way. And, I sort of, at the Flow Research Collective, we talk about, there's always a sequence, and in the peak performance space, you see a lot of people screw this up. I would say the order of the process has always got to be insight, research, publication, communication. And what I mean by that is have your breakthrough insight, whatever it is, then go make sure it's a real insight. This is where you're testing your hypothesis, and one hypothesis you can falsify it, all that stuff. And then publish your insight someplace so other people can comment upon it. Then you get to stand on a stage and tell people it's true or teach it to other people. And that's a lot slower than most people want to proceed, right? Like you see this in the thought leader space. So you see it where somebody wants to write a book to as a marketing tool. So they have their insight. They skip most of the research phase, or they do maybe a little bit of surface level research to convince themselves that it's true. They don't publish, or they put in a book right off the bat. Like a lot of my big science ideas, by the way, that showed up in books, I didn't have the peer review process, but what I had is magazines. They had fact checking. They would call the same people who would peer review a paper about, they would fact check it, right? Like they would fact check my facts with 3 to 5 sources. That's how it goes with fact checkers kind of thing. And they're the most anal retentive people in the world, and they're very difficult to please, right? And they're their job, their goal is to find ways you screwed up. They prove they're doing their job by proving that you didn't do your job. So it's an adversarial relationship. So you go in, sort of knowing that. So I was using magazines as ways to kind of do peer review stuff. So long before I started writing about flow in West of Jesus, I think I wrote 20 to 30 articles on flow and sort of mystical experiences and the neurobiology of mystical experiences, all the questions that were in that book for Psychology Today and Discover and the New York Times, and it was less about letting the public comment on it and more about the actual fact-checking process and the fact that I knew they were going to call and I was going to get to call top people and say, is this true or not? And so it was made me really comfortable with it. Wasn't quite the scientific method, but it was closer in that neighborhood even early on. And I also think one of the things that really matters here is it's not really a peak performance thing, but in today's market, quality matters a lot. We're bombarded with so much stuff at this point. The AIs that filter the world for us, used to be you could sort of sneak past them with keywords and marketing tricks and things like this. But for example, in content, AIs are now able to watch entire movies, digest what they've watched and sort of rate it from a creative, artistic level, right? You've got AIs that can write books or write movie scripts or write, like we've seen all this stuff. So what it means is that our filters for the world are getting more quality based. So a lot of the like kind of info marketer turned thought leader experts that have sort of arisen on maybe less than solid foundations, they could do it because you could game the keywords. Right. You could game SEO, and you could like there was a way to make a living that way because of the way search is starting to be done. Those portals are closing, in my opinion. So maybe this doesn't apply to everybody's job, but if you have any portion of what you do is public facing, right, quality is going to matter more and more, I think, going forward this century. So another reason to really get a rigorous truth filter in place.
What was the stack for the scientific method? It was hypothesis testing through...
A couple different ways to approach it, but, usually most people, if they have a question, they'll start with a sort of a literature review, right? And that'll also usually be a colleague review too, right? Like read everything, talk to everyone. Big data gathering on the front end. Create your hypothesis. This is where I think the data points, right? Make sure it's falsifiable, because if you can't prove it's wrong, how are you going to know it's right? Right? You brought this up earlier. This is Karl Popper's work. And then test it, right? And, science likes to shrink things down as small as possible in the lab so they can get rid of the noise and the variables. That is one approach. One of the thinkers I really like is Gary Klein. He's an intuition researcher, and he is an advocate for kind of what he calls naturalistic psychology. So when he was studying the neuroscience of decision-making, instead of reducing decision-making to really simple lab tasks, that are being performed by undergraduates, he went and observed firefighters in the field making hard decisions while combating. Right. So there's different ways to do that. We do it slightly differently at the Flow Research Collective as a general rule. The literature review, we'll do our hypothesis, and before we actually take things in the lab and start really reducing them, we'll often introduce them to our community as hypotheses and say, hey, there's 100,000 of you guys. Please go test this and feed us back your information. And then we'll take that. So it's an extra layer, but I find that it saves us a lot of time in the lab because we're crowdsourcing it, and you get sort of iron out a lot of anomalies when 100,000 people are participating. So another reason why, if you're watching this and you're part of the Flow Research Collective community, and we send out surveys and things like that, that's what we're doing, right? We're going from hypothesis into, we're about to take this in the lab and start getting jiggy with it and simplifying and shrinking it. But before we do that, and this, one of the reasons is because I like the naturalistic method. I think Gary Klein has learned a ton of stuff about intuition that, for example, Daniel Kahneman, who worked in the lab very much, did not learn. And sort of the current, by the way, thinking on intuition blends both of those approaches. Like they've come together, right? And I think there's wisdom there that joins them a little bit. So how you sort of approach the scientific method, there are a couple different ways, and it sort of depends on who is your mentor in science, where you learned it from.
Well, it's also, it's extremely important in business that using the scientific method, in terms of Steve Blank's work and Eric Ries's work on the lean startup, learning in business and in startups is very much so happens through.
Well, yeah, it's an agile practice. Method. Lots of rapid experimentation. Jeff Bezos, when we were writing Bold, said to us that the success of Amazon absolutely depends on how many experiments I run per month, per week, per day, right? Like so, and Skunkworks, which are one of the great innovation accelerators of all time, are also built on rapid experimentation. Right? Rapid experimentation, little tests of truth. Is it real? Is it real?
Exactly.
Is it real?
Right. Knowing what's an assumption, creating a hypothesis out of it, validating it or invalidating, and then deploying resources versus just going all in on things that are untested. Yeah, that makes sense.
And the last one that we have to jump to, the third approach, is first principle thinking. It's a really old idea, but Elon Musk, I think, has probably brought it back into prominence more than anybody else. The idea here is to reduce things to sort of their basic decision-making parts, so it's easier to explain by example. when Elon Musk was interested in getting into the solar business, right? Tesla is an electric car that's a sort of a solar thing, and then Solar Cities is an actual solar company. Everybody said, no, you can't do this. We don't have batteries. The batteries are never going to be long enough to really back this up, and nobody can make affordable batteries. And Elon decided he would have to make affordable batteries. Like, that was going to be the next step, and it wasn't a particularly great business market. And the way Elon approaches it, in a sense, in a business decision, this isn't really first principle thinking, but it's nice to talk about it, is he de-risks the decision. So he'll say, okay, facing this battery question, a company built on where we are now has like a 30% chance of success and a 70% chance of failure, and that's unacceptable. At what level would I be willing to launch the company? I think he says he's willing to launch a company if he can get it above a 70% chance of success, right? So he's got to ask himself questions. Well, what de-risks 30 and gets it to 70, right? And cost of battery was one of the big ones. And everybody said basically that like they were never going to get efficient enough and cost effective. So what did he do? First principle thinking says, normal business thinking would be, let's go look at what our competitors are doing. How much do their batteries cost? How much are they spending? Okay, maybe we'll be a little more efficient than them. And let's say we hire better engineers so we can chop 10%, blah, blah. Musk said, what are you talking about? He went to the London metals market. He looked up the price of cadmium, of nickel, of all the major components of a battery. He realized they were pennies on a dollar, and everything else was technology, and technology always improves over time, and it's speeding up exponentially. So he went into the battery business, and now his gigafactories dominate. He's making the best, cheapest batteries. The Powerwall is essentially what is allowing us to go solar into the future, one of the big things. That's first principle thinking. Another example is when he wanted to build the rocket ship. Everybody else was, saying, oh, it's this expensive. Well, he looked up all the core components and he went, no, it's not.
Yeah.
Like, right. So that's another kind of truth filter. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, and I'm not saying you should use this over that. I think you can use each one depending on the situation. Just a toolbox. And the point is, if you're going to accelerate learning to maximize flow and performance, you need a way to assess the information you're encountering very, very quickly, right? So you can trust it, so you can build things on it and not have to worry about an unstable foundation for where you're going, right? You don't want to build anything on an unstable foundation. And flow, you're moving really fast. An unstable foundation can really cost you, right? And so it's really important to be able to assess the information really, really quickly. So growth mindset gets your brain ready to learn. Truth filters tell you how to assess what you're learning very quickly. And sort of the next learning module in the stack is the question of, well, what materials do you learn from? And that's where we'll be turning our attention in the next installment.
And I think, interestingly, when you integrate all the truth filters, you end up back at a mindset piece, which is kind of developing just a skeptical, questioning mindset or disposition in general, which is not necessarily something everyone possesses and takes a little bit of training.
Well, it's so the tricky thing for peak performance, good point, and you're right, but it's not just because if you've noticed, people who are super, super skeptical all the time, one, they don't seem to be as happy. Right?
That is very true.
And, for example, some of the harder groups of people to work with, though we've ended up being very successful at this, but it took a while, both lawyers and accountants. And one of the reasons is they have backwards-facing jobs, right? They're always rear-guard actions, trained to be very, 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 very skeptical. And skepticism is great, but you need optimism for performance, right? So you need a
optimistic skepticism,
rational optimism, optimistic skepticism, right? So you have to balance it, and and I think that takes some time, right? I think everybody, when you start learning the skills of critical thinking, which is essentially truth filters would fall under the umbrella of critical thinking, you can have a period on the front end of like massive doubt and massive skepticism, and it's sort of worth tempering that, right? That's sort of like, it's new learners conversion zealotry in a sense, and it's helpful because it helps you kind of burn in these skills, But remember, you want to tinge it with optimism. Right?
Yeah, it's a good point. A little dose of optimism in the mix is key there. Why do you think skeptical people are often less happy? Is it because the skepticism brings in pessimism that they haven't explicitly replaced with optimism? Or?
I think it comes down to, at a really basic level, threat detection, right? We know under normal conditions we're taking in 9 negative bits of information from every positive, but if you become really, really skeptical, or if you become a conspiracy theory junkie, or et cetera, you will start taking in even more negative information, right? Just as you can tilt the scale towards the positive, you can tilt it towards the negative.
The inverse of a gratitude practice.
Inverse of a gratitude practice would be an actively skeptical practice in a sense. Active skepticism in this. And I mean, you have to just, I think, there's no perfect world of forms, in my opinion. And the Enlightenment ideal of, an ideal truth, right? An absolute truth. I'm a little postmodern. I'm distrustful of those ideas. I'm more of a Nietzschean in how I approach that thinking. Same thing with I've spent enough time around scientists, around people who hunt for the truth for a living. I have hunted for the truth for a living, as a journalist, as a scientist, I've spent my life doing this, and it can sour you. It can make you really bitter on the world. And I've come to the conclusion that because I don't think there's an absolute truth, I don't expect it. I don't expect it out of anybody or anything, I've really, really hard to give you as much of it as I possibly can. But you know what I mean? Like any scientific fact I present you, even if it's the thing that I believe this more than anything else. Well, the history of science tells us 50 years from now we could discover something that overturns this completely. Right? That's the history of science.
More about proximity.
So
truth
yeah, I don't think there's an absolute, but you want to start to get closer and closer and closer, and being able to do it more quickly and more quickly and more quickly, because it's the speed, right? I think what happens with the skepticism is they get hung up on the truth. Yeah. I'm in it for the peak performance, so I want I want the truth to be as useful as possible in a sense, but not be an impediment to performance.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, more of a pragmatic approach. Anything else you want to mention on learning, mindset, truth filters before we wrap it up?
No, but you make me feel like there should be something else. Is there something else you'd like to mention?
No, I think we got it. Unless you've got anything burning top of mind. So, yeah, thank you for tuning in, folks. Before you all jump, I want to take a quick moment to mention Zero to Dangerous, which is our flagship peak performance training here at the Flow Research Collective. If you're an entrepreneur or a leader or a knowledge worker, or you just want to spend more time in flow, then Zero to Dangerous may be a fit, and you can consider applying below. You will work one-on-one with one of our PhD level peak performance coaches. You'll join a network of like-minded peak performers from across the globe. You'll do a whole curriculum of neuroscience-based peak performance tools, and we go into topics like this and many more. So if you want to learn how to spend more of your workday in flow, it could be a really good fit for you. You can click the button below. You can apply, 30-second application form, and then you can book a free call with our team. They'll answer any questions that you may have about training with us and working with us, and we may end up seeing you inside Zero to Dangerous. But for now, all the best.
One thing I forgot about truth filters. Okay. So if Zero to Dangerous is maybe not your thing, that apply button, if you push it 57 times while saying, I am in flow, I am in flow, I am in flow, absolutely nothing's going to happen.
Try it anyway.
Try it at home. Conduct your own experiment.
Be skeptical.
Go in.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.